He said worship's officially over with the beat, so you can find your seat, but before you do, say hello to two people around you. Bala, you were so excited. Now you have to stand back up. Oh, it's just awful. It's good to see everyone today. Got a nice group. So thank you, worship team. Thank you. I always find it fun when Sylvia's leading worship because you feel like it's workout with Sylvia, you know. I think she missed her calling. There's, Peloton's going out of business, but so there's opportunity, So anyways, hey, so good to see everyone. And we are jumping into our summer series that we are calling The Other Guys. So these are stories from the Bible that we maybe don't read all the time. And I was thinking this week about a couple of different things. And I grew up playing sports. I love playing sports. And everything about my young adult life and my childhood was usually revolving around sports. And when I was 15 or 16 years old, I was on the cross-country team in the U.S. Oh, which means, we had the T-shirts that said, "Our sport is your punishment," because we used to run for fun. Well, let me just tell you, this is totally not in my notes, but this is how every cross-country race would go. There's like 2,000 people usually in the race, and then you start and you take off running, and you have to all run into this tiny little trail. So you're just running, you run like this. So you just knock people around. It's a lot of fun, really exciting. And then you get into the trail, and after 800 meters of a 5-kilometer race, or half a kilometer for those of you needing some help with some of your math, you realize these things start going through your head. Why am I doing this? What is going on? I did this voluntarily. And then about three quarters of the way through, you're just kind of frustrated because at that point you're just thinking, this was a horrible idea. Who does this? What is this? And then at the end, you're excited because you're at the end, finally, and you're passing people and you're running, there's crowds, and it's a very interesting sport. And our team was actually quite good. I was okay, but our team was really good. And we had a couple of guys that were great. One of them, as a 15-year-old, he placed in the top 10 in the state of Texas, which means that of a state of about 25 million people, he was good. But then there was this other guy, and his name was Brandon. Turn to your neighbor and say, Brandon. See, Brandon was even better. Brandon was so fast, and he was so strong, and it felt like he could run forever on these 5-kilometer races. I feel like whenever God was picturing when he was making humans, he was like, this is how a human should run. They will look like this. The picture of Brandon had to have been in there because he was amazing, so much talent. He worked so hard, but it was interesting. Like, I remember one day during practice, we were practicing for track, and he ran the 800-meter race. So the Olympics is coming up, so we've been watching track documentaries, getting ready for our Olympics. USA. Oh. Anyways. Yeah, I know. Here we are in Poland, and no one's chanting USA with us. It's awful. This is unbelievable. But no, I can remember one time he was practicing the 800 meters, and he broke our conference record. That's how fast he was. But what was really interesting was that whenever you got to the race, something would happen with Brandon. He would get so nervous, he would get so stressed, or he wouldn't feel good that day. I don't know what would happen, but over and over again, and very rarely would he actually run the race he was capable of doing. And I can remember at one point, there was one race where I was passing Brandon, which if I was passing Brandon, it was not good for anyone. It was not good for our team. It was not good for him because I usually was usually he had already stretched, got some water by the time I finished. That's usually the difference on how good he was. But for whatever reason, he could never fully live up to the greatness that was inside of him. And I started thinking, and the guy that we're going to talk about today, we're going to call him the greatest king that never was. Because if you talk to anyone that's done athletes or played sports or done anything like that, you realize each one of them has a story of a guy like Brandon. So someone that was maybe a football player, or maybe you played basketball, or my dad was an American football coach, and he would tell stories of this player that was unbelievable, but you've never heard of him. He would line up against professional football players and absolutely destroy them, but you've never heard of him because there's just something where it just didn't quite work out. And it's the greatest whatever that never was, the greatest footballer, the greatest that never quite was. And today we're going to talk about the greatest king that never was. And you've heard who this guy is, but it's because you know a lot about the next king. So we're talking about King Saul today. And every time we talk about King Saul, usually we're talking about King Saul because we know King David. So some of you in the front row, you are on the same page. So I'm so proud of you guys. So yeah, every time you hear about King Saul, we know it was King Saul whenever David came to fight Goliath. We know it was King Saul that was being tormented and David would come and play the harp. We know it was King Saul that had security issues and started trying to kill David, and David spared his life. We know who King Saul is because of King David. But did you know that there was a King Saul before a David? So today what I want us to do is I want us to look at the greatest king that never was and discover 3 key things I think that we can learn from him so that we walk into the greatness that God has given us and has called us into. Because Jesus did not come, Jesus did not die so that we can live an okay life. He did not come so that we can have all of this opportunity but never fully live and step into what he has for us and what he's called us to do and what he's purposed for us. So I don't know about you, but I don't want my story in my life to be the greatest that never was. It was like, it's almost, but not quite there. So let's turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 10. So now at this time in the story of Israel, so they did not have a king, and they looked around at all the other nations around that they're always fighting against. So back in that time, you just fought people all the time. That's what you did. And they said, hey, everyone else has a king. We want a king. So they had this huge debate, and so finally God says, okay, I'll give you a king. So Samuel comes, and he anoints Saul, the son of Kish, to be king. Turn to your neighbor and say, Saul. So Saul here, he has been anointed to be king, and we're at his coronation ceremony. So this is the moment where he is going to be crowned king. Everyone's going to cheer. A couple of years ago, we watched on TV King Charles, because we actually had a friend that was at the ceremony, but we watched King Charles of England, and it's a huge ordeal whenever he was being crowned king. Everyone walks in, there's a huge procession. You have your little crown, you have your little, staff and all your other wonderful things. So this is happening for the first time in Israel. This is a huge day. The biggest day in the nation of Israel in hundreds of years was happening in this moment. And Saul already knows he's going to be king. And so they start this official process. So Samuel gets up. He says, the king will be from the tribe of Benjamin. And then we come down to, it'll be from the family of Kish. So which Kish, by the way, means like strong and authority and like really fierce. But also it kind of means a little bit like stern and a little bit harsh as well. So it's kind of like this real powerful, a little bit mean person. That's who Kish was. And it was going to be his son. So everyone finally realizes that. And Samuel's on the stage and he's announcing, now please welcome the first king of Israel, King Saul. Did anyone get him from the door? Maybe he's on this side. Please welcome King Saul. Does anyone know where King Saul is? They cannot find him. He is hidden. He is nowhere to be seen. The biggest moment, the most important moment of his life, and one of the most significant moments of the nation of Israel's life, and King Saul is nowhere to be found. So they go back to God. They're like, did we miss this? Is there another Saul we don't know about? Like, can the real Saul please stand up? So we're trying to figure out who this is. And God actually tells Samuel, no, he's actually in the baggage. Saul had hidden himself in the bags. In the greatest moment, the greatest opportunity of his life, he was hiding in his baggage. How oftentimes do we go hide in what we used to know or hide in the baggage of the past whenever God's calling us into something much, much bigger, and when God's asking us to step up and be the person that he's ordained to lead his people? But instead, Saul's over here in his baggage. You know, I can't help but think the son of Kish, strong, power, harsh. I wonder what that was like growing up. I wonder if he had been told so much about how well he had to perform, how well he had to be, how a good son would behave, like how harsh it must have been to have this strong, mean father. And he was sitting there thinking, I'm about to be the king of Israel. I've got to run. I'm afraid that I'm going to fail, because everything about his life had probably been a performance that he had to do. So he decided, I'm just going to go hide in my bags. How sad is that in the greatest moment of his life, he was so afraid that he was going to fail. And he went and stood in his baggage. Do we live our life like that? Because if you read who Saul was, they get him on stage, and he was a man's man. It says that everyone comes up to his shoulder, so he was big, he was strong, he was a good-looking guy. So all the guys wanted to be him, all the girls wanted to marry him. Like, he was the guy. You know, he was exactly, and that's what Samuel tells the people. He's like, is this perfection right here? Is this not who you want to be your king? And everyone's excited. Everyone is so thrilled, except for Saul, because he's still living in his baggage instead of living in the moment that God had called him into. So if you follow the story of Saul, you realize that he does some good things. He unites the people of Israel. He wins some victories, because as a king, a lot of time, you spend a lot of your time fighting other people so that you would actually still have a kingdom. And so he's doing well. But then we come to 1 Samuel chapter 13, just a little bit later. I have to feel a little bit, this is a side note, I have to feel a little bit bad for Saul, because he's the first one to be king of Israel. And so there wasn't like his father or someone else that he could talk to about, hey, how do you govern these people that have never, and none of these people have ever had a king before, so they don't even know what they're doing as well. Like, how am I supposed to do that? And you can't talk to other kings. There's not like a round table of like where all the kings come together and say, hey, what's the problems going on in your kingdom? Because all those kings are trying to invade your country. So they're like, here's what you do. You just let me take over and it will be fine. So Saul doesn't have a lot of help, but he does have Samuel and he does have the Lord, which is more than enough. But what we find is that Saul becomes impatient a lot of times. So here's Saul. He's in another situation that's pretty normal. He's about to fight against the Philistines, because the Philistines are about to try to invade Israel. So the Philistines were always fighting the people of Israel. You've heard the story of Goliath and David. Goliath was a Philistine. So this is some normal people that are always fighting the Israelites, and they're about to invade again, and they have been waiting for Samuel to come so that they can worship the Lord by offering sacrifices. But Samuel's running a little bit late. I don't know what happened. Maybe the sacrifices didn't want to come as fast as they were supposed to. I don't know what was going on, but he was a little bit late. And Saul started feeling the pressure. He started feeling the pressure of people that were becoming bored and anxious, like, oh, maybe we'll just go home and we'll go do something else. And so what he does is he goes ahead and he actually makes the sacrifices himself. So he goes ahead and he worships God without Samuel and without the proper way of doing that. And listen to what it says. This is something really important. It begins in verse 12. This is Paul, and This is Saul saying this. He says, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord yet. So I forced myself, and I offered the burnt offering. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Why was Saul worshiping God? No, we're not talking about what Jordan was talking about earlier, where sometimes there's feelings inside of us where we just don't feel like worshiping. We're not talking about that. But if you read, he said, I don't know if God's going to bless me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to worship him so that he'll bless me. And I forced myself. I forced something. I performed for God so that I would get his favor. You know what we call that? We call that religion. If you read the story of Saul, what you find more often than not is that his relationship with God was business transaction based. And so he said, you know what, God, I want you to bless me so that we can have a good battle coming up. So here, I'm going to worship you. It wasn't what can I give to the Lord? Instead, it was what can I get from him in my place of worship? And it was a selfish way of worshiping so that he could get something from God instead of standing up and offering himself as a place of worship. The greatest king that never was. Worship God out of religion instead of relationship. Worship God out of performance and duty so that he can get something from God instead of realizing that he just has to offer himself to God. Saul starts off in some baggage. Saul lives his life as a transaction relationship with God. Do you feel like that in your own life? Is your relationship with God, is it based off of transactions so that you can get on with your life? Oh God, I've prayed. I've read my Bible. I came to church. I even stayed after to eat Mexican food, which, I mean, come on, that's not a big sacrifice. Let's be honest. I've done these things, God. So can you make sure this goes well in my life? Can you make sure that this happens? Can you make sure that this works? Is your relationship based off transactions? Are you tipping the scale? Or is it based off the relationship? Where you're offering yourself. Romans 12 describes it, offering yourself as a sacrifice. That's the daily act of worship. Saul has the breaking point in chapter 15. And to me, this is the saddest story of them all. So there was a group of people known as the Amalekites. And once again, just like you do all the time during that time, the people of Israel find themselves fighting the Amalekites. And you could look through the history of the Amalekites, and they were a horrible people that were brutal against the people of God, and they were just not good people, and God had had enough. So he told Saul to do something extreme where he said, even kill the king and take out all the animals. I don't want anything that was the Amalekite you don't need to take anything from them. That was the attack that they did on the Amalekites. And so Saul has been charged to do something, and he goes and he has victory against the Amalekites, but he keeps the best animals. The king is still alive. He keeps all of these extra things that God has specifically said not to do. So Samuel shows up. And he says, Saul, how's it going? Oh, it's going amazing. We had an amazing victory. We followed the command of the Lord and we have won. Are you sure? Why do I still hear the cows? Why do I hear the sheep? Were you not charged to remove all of that? Wasn't that the command of the Lord? It's like, yes. But the people, they wanted to keep it so that we can offer sacrifices to God later, which probably meant that they were probably going to offer some sacrifice and have a nice party as well. You know, it's funny how that seems to always work out the way that does. But he's sitting there and he said, the people, they wanted this. And Samuel says something, and at the core of the difference between the greatest king that never was and the great king we know as David was this. Samuel said, though you are little, it's verse 17, though you are little in your own eyes, did God not make you the king over all of Israel? You see, that was the issue with Saul at the core of it. It wasn't that he didn't believe God was great. It wasn't that he didn't believe that Israel was worth fighting for. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see the big man that God had put as king over his people. He saw the little boy hiding in the baggage. Though you are little in your own eyes, did God not put you as king over Israel? And this is the difference between the two, because you can read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, it's about verse 12, whenever David is finally king over all of Israel, it says these things about David. It says that, and David recognized that God had put him king over all of Israel. David understood that it was God that had put him there, and therefore he could walk in authority as the king over Israel. But listen to this. It's not, and it says not just to establish his kingdom, but to establish the kingdom of Israel. See, David understood that whenever he walked in the authority and the identity of who God had called him to be and who God had destined him to be, then all of Israel was blessed. And Saul was over here still hiding in the bags even though he was king. The greatest king that never was had an identity crisis from the beginning. It wasn't an identity crisis about God. It's an identity crisis about himself. But if you think about it, Saul only knew God on a business transaction. David knew God intimately. You can read the story of Saul, read the story of David. David was far from perfect. He actually did far worse things than Saul did. But what made David so unique? He knew God on a close personal level. And because he knew that anything and everything that happened in his life was because of his God. And when he knew and understood that, it meant he could confidently walk in the identity that God gave him. Not in who he became, not in what he built, but what God had given him. That's why we know him as the great King David. And the greatest king that never was. He had an identity crisis from the beginning. He was afraid to fail. He tried to force God to bless him. But you see, whenever we understand and have that relationship with God, and when we begin to understand and walk in our identity as sons and daughters, it changes everything. Where whenever in the greatest moment of Saul's life, he hides in the baggage. When David sees the biggest obstacle in his life, he runs at Goliath. Whenever he's trying to offer sacrifices to get God to bless him, whenever David recognizes the Ark of the Covenant, the little presence of God, every 6 feet, every 2 meters, he stops and offers worship for hours on end for the journey. Not to get something, but to recognize God. If you just want to be a footnote, the starting point of someone else's journey, just like Saul. You can start by just looking at yourself as this little bitty person. But the truth is, Jesus didn't come because he saw a little you. Jesus didn't die on the cross because he saw someone so small. When Jesus looks at you, he sees the greatness of the Son of God. He sees the greatness of daughters of God. He sees the greatness of who you can become. He sees the greatness of your identity when you fully walk in that. So what if we looked at our lives like Jesus looks at ours? You know, I believe this is the biggest lie that the enemy tells us. Oftentimes, we're okay about Jesus. We're okay about God. We're not okay about us. Because we'd rather live in our baggage. We've got to get rid of the baggage. Feel the pressure of people around us, so we try to create this transaction to prove that God is going to bless us. Or will we walk in our identity so that he will establish who we are and the world around us will be blessed? Because that's the promise and the difference between David and Saul. The greatest king that never was, it's because he never believed he could be that king. God did. Samuel did. Even the people did. The greatest king that never was, never believed it. And because of that now, we now see Jesus in the line of David instead of the lineage of Saul. We name our kids David. We read the story of David. We throw rocks like David. Why? Because he understood what God had did in his life, and he walked in that identity. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for this time together. Lord, I thank you that you gave us so many incredible stories in the Bible. Not just the stories of success, not just the stories when people get it right, but the stories when people miss it, even though you gave them the opportunity. God, we thank you for the story of Saul.